Throughout history and the centuries, there have been many terrifying and barbaric execution methods used to bring the life of a condemned criminal to an end. Lots of these were performed in public with the intention of terrifying and scaring others into submission. For example, hanging, drawing and quartering was deployed in England as a way of dealing with the worst traitors. Execution has dated back since ancient times. For example, in Rome, people were even thrown to lions or were thrown off cliffs. It is only really recent that thought has been given to the suffering someone encounters in their final moments, and execution has made their own tweaks to bring the life of someone to an end quicker. In this video, we're going to look at a number of execution methods that were used in the past that you should really know about. To support our channel, please click subscribe. Dismemberment was given as an execution method for many people throughout the centuries in different lands, and it was done in a number of different ways. In the medieval period and modern era, it could be done by tying the condemned person's limbs to chains or other restraints, and then these would be attached to something that could move quickly in a different direction. Horses, animals and other vehicles could be used to do this, literally tearing someone limb from limb, but executioners would sometimes sever the tendons and ligaments to make the limbs be literally torn from the body easier. But one common method of doing this, as mentioned, was chaining 4 horses to the condemned person's arms and legs, and then driving them off in different directions, and the limbs would be separated from the body and torso and pulled apart. This was used in France for the most serious offenders. Francois Ravaillac was a Catholic zealot who assassinated King Henry IV. It was said that the king's coach, his coach, entering from Saint-Honoré to Ferronnerie Street, was blocked on one side by a cart filled with wine and the other by a cart filled with hay. Ravaillac climbed on the wheels of the above-mentioned coach, and with a knife trenchant on both sides stabbed him between the second and third ribs. Following this, Ravaillac was tortured before he was taken to the Place de Grève in Paris, and he was tortured just before he was pulled apart by horses, which was a method of execution reserved for regicides. It was said of his execution that he was condemned to be tortured with red-hot pincers on 4 limbs and on each breast. His wounds were to be sprinkled with molten lead and boiling oil, and his body was then torn in pieces by 4 horses, the remains being subsequently burned. Mikhail Piekarski in 1620 was also executed in this manner for attempting to kill the Polish king Sigismund III. An executioner tore his body up slowly with heated pliers whilst he was alive on a cart in Warsaw, and he was then taken to a platform where his right arm was cut off and incinerated before he was then dismembered by horses. His ordeal was shocking, but then 137 years later the punishment was used again for the high-profile execution of Robert François Damiens, the attempted assassin of King Louis XV of France. It was said that his last words were, "O death, why art thou so long in coming?" as his ordeal was horrifying and brutal. It was said that his limbs did not separate easily after the horses bolted, and that the horses had to perform the execution again after the executioner, Charles Henry Sanson, had to sever his tendons with a knife. It was said that his torso was still living before it was then burned at the stake. One witness said of the execution that Damiens' agony went on for hours as each torture was applied. When the horses failed to disconnect the sinews between his body and his limbs, his body still alive was quartered with a knife. His friend, the infamous Casanova, reports that he watched the dreadful sight for 4 hours. "I was obliged to turn my face and to stop my ears as I heard his piercing shrieks, half his body being torn from him." But even as late as 1781, being pulled apart by horses was given to a Peruvian rebel leader named Tupac Amaru II. He was given this death sentence by Spanish colonial authorities, and his death sentence said that his tongue will be cut out and that he will be forced to watch the executions of his family, before his hands and feet were tied to 4 horses who would then be driven away at once towards the 4 corners of the plaza, pulling the arms and legs from his body. The torso will then be taken to the hill overlooking the city, where it will be burned on a bonfire. Tupac Amaru's head will be sent to Tinta to be displayed for 3 days in the place of public execution, and then placed upon a pike at the principal entrance to the city. One of his arms will be sent to Tunguska, where he was a cacique, and the other arm to the capital province of Carabaya, to be similarly displayed in these locations. His legs will be sent to Levitka and Santa Rosas in the provinces of Chumbivilcas and Lamba, respectively. But being ripped apart by horses was used in the quartering part of the execution for centuries. It's believed that this would have been a quick method of separating the limbs from the torso, and things were incredibly brutal. Witnesses seeing this would be disgusted by what they saw, as the horses were driven off in different directions. There were accounts throughout history in which animals were used in different executions, as elephants throughout the centuries were used to stomp some condemned people to death. But in a similar manner, there was an account in which the barbaric corsairs or privateers on pirates utilised the ripped apart by horses as a killing method and applied it to their naval activities. One 17th century Dutchman said that a frequent maritime death penalty among the corsairs was to chain the hands and feet to 4 different ships. When the ships sailed off in different directions, the chains got tight and the man in between them was torn apart. This kind of thought had been applied during the Roman period, who utilised military discipline to ensure their soldiers did not break rank. Emperor Aurelian had a reputation for strictness, and he brought in a rule that soldiers who seduced the wives of their hosts would have their legs tied to 2 bent-down trees, which were then released and the soldier would be ripped in 2. This was used for centuries, and a British diplomat in 1808, travelling to the Shah, wrote what he saw regarding someone being torn apart by trees. He wrote, "For the king never pardons theft, and orders a convicted thief to be executed instantly. The mode is as followed. 2 young trees are by main strength brought together at their summits, and they are fastened with cords together. The culprit is then brought out, and his legs are tied with ropes, which are again carried up and fixed to the top of the trees. The cords that force the trees together are then cut, and in the elasticity and power of this spring, the body of the thief is torn asunder, and left thus to hang divided on each separate tree. The inflexibility of the king in this point has given to a road of security, which in former times was little known." Being torn apart by horses was a terrifying and brutal method of execution, which resulted in the horrific death of a condemned prisoner. It was used for the most serious of offenders, including those who tried to kill kings and members of the royal family. It was a shocking sight for people to see, but even those who would flock to witness executions would be disgusted by what they saw. It was comparable with hanging during a quartering, used by Henry VIII and other kings, to send a clear message to the public. Death by boiling was an execution method in which a person was killed by being immersed in boiling liquids or water. It was not as common as methods such as beheading, hanging during a quartering, and burning at the stake, but it was used in many different countries and continents, and was known for being particularly horrific, due to the fact the executioner often dragged out the killing process over a longer amount of time. Some people were pulled out of the boiling liquid when they were alive, and were made to suffer, being lowered into the pot a number of times, which would make their suffering significantly worse. Often it wasn't just water which could be placed inside of a large pot, the cauldron or kettle. Executioners were also known for filling it up with oil, tar, and using a hook and pulley system to dunk the person in and out, which would have been terrifying for the condemned as they faced the boiling pot. There were a number of people who were executed and boiled to death in Scotland. John Haroldson, who was known as the Bloody Earl of Orkney, ordered the boiling of Bishop of Caithness, Adam of Melrose, and a monk called Serlo. The bishop had been attempting to collect taxes that he had increased, and he raised the price, and with this it was said, "That the devil take the bishop and his butter, you may roast him if you please." On the 11th of September 1222, a group of husbandmen gathered to protest, screaming "roast him alive." Then the bishop's monk Serlo went to deal with it, and he was killed. Then the bishop was dragged into the kitchen, and the kitchen was then burned down, and it was said that he was boiled alive after the earl had given this permission. Some sources claim that he was burned rather than boiled, but Alexander III killed 400 people for the crime against his bishop. William de Soulis, a nobleman who conspired against Robert the Bruce, and whom it's considered was a sorcerer who worked with evil spirits, was boiled alive in 1321. More boilings continued as Melville, the sheriff of the Mearns, and the laird of Glenbervie, who were both hated for their strictness and rules, were thrown into a pot and boiled alive. It was said that after they died, the nobles each enjoyed a spoon of the broth made by them. But boiling was used across Europe as a way of punishing counterfeiters and coin forgers, and these executions were carried out in public to put the other people off greatly committing these crimes. These were seen as stealing from the crown, and by punishing the public in the most savage ways, it was seen as effective deterrence. In 1392, a man was boiled alive in Nuremberg for murdering his own mother, and in 1452 in Danzig, coin forgers were boiled, and this continued the following decades. A man in 1687 in Bremen was boiled to death in oil, and was accused of helping coin forgers escape justice, and some towns today still display their boiling execution cauldrons. The Holy Roman Empire used boiling to death in oil for coin forgers and those murderers whose crimes were particularly heinous and shocking. It was also used in Asia, and in the 1500s the semi-legendary Japanese bandit Ishikawa Goemon and his son were boiled alive, and then in the 17th century it was carried out in India. A Sikh martyr in 1675 was boiled to death in Delhi after refusing to convert to Islam, and he was first put in a cauldron of cold water, which was then heated up to boiling point, where he was cooked to death. It was said how he was tied with an iron chain and was prevented from escaping. Only his head and shoulders could be seen to the crowd before he roasted into a block of charcoal. But the most famous account of boiling alive took place during the reign of King Henry VIII, the infamous Tudor monarch who sentenced over 70,000 people to death during his time on the throne. This included 2 of his own wives who were beheaded inside the walls of the Tower of London. But there was a scandal in February 1531 which emerged from the household of the Bishop of Rochester, John Fisher. Fisher was a staunch Catholic, but inside of his household, a cook had allegedly poisoned the porridge. It's believed that Fisher was the target of this assassination attempt, but he did not eat as he was fasting at the time. But the incident led to the deaths of 2 people, one man and a woman, who had sought shelter and charity from John Fisher. This incident threatened to discredit and cause chaos with Fisher's reputation, and some believe that Henry VIII could have even been behind the plot to kill and poison Fisher, as he was a staunch supporter of his former wife Catherine of Aragon, and he despised the changes that Henry was making to the church, and Fisher did not respect Henry's position as the supreme head of the Church of England. The man behind the poisoning plot allegedly was Richard Roos, Fisher's cook, and Henry VIII then changed the rules on treason. Roos was captured and imprisoned at the Tower of London, and was tortured, and he believed he was putting a laxative into the porridge, but claimed he didn't mean to kill anyone. Henry VIII made changes then to the treason laws, and made boiling a capital punishment method and execution method for those who were found guilty of poisoning. This was made because of Roos's actions, and it's believed that punishment was brought in to send a message to the cook. Roos was brought to Smithfield, a common place of burning at the stake, on the 15th of April 1532. Over a period of 2 hours he was executed being boiled alive. One contemporary account stated that Roos was tied up in chains and gibbeted before he was then lowered in and out of the boiling water 3 times until he was dead. Another account described the execution saying, "He roared mightily loud, and divers women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw, and were carried away half dead, and other men and women did not seem frightened by the boiling alive, but would prefer to see the headsman at work." It was said the execution made many people sick and ill as it was so brutal. Boiling alive in England was used again for a woman named Margaret Davy, who used poison to murder, but it was then repealed as an execution method by Edward VI's Council. In modern times, it was claimed that in Peru between 1980 and 2000 that a number of militants were executed by boiling, and that the government of Uzbekistan has allegedly boiled some men accused of being terrorists. But boiling alive has to be one of the most brutal execution methods used throughout history. The people who would witness these public killings would be haunted by what they saw, as someone was either submerged or slowly boiled, or were lowered in and out of a boiling pot on a pulley system. It has to be one of the worst methods used along with burning at the stake, and would have been completely sadistic, and those monarchs and rulers who issued it had to be some of the most brutal rulers in history. Bottle dungeons were as it is described in the name. They were a bottle shape, and these were dug inside of towers and castles, and they had a deep pit at the bottom, and then the entrance of the dungeon was higher and thinner. The bottle shape made it impossible for someone to escape from, and they could not climb out as the shape of the walls made this impossible. The bottle's shape also meant that the pit would be a significant fall for someone if they were thrown into it, and they could either be cramped or rather spacious. As the centuries rolled on, the use of dungeons developed and changed over time, and these rooms also doubled up as torture chambers. Being deep underground, the screams of a prisoner could not be heard. One alleged oubliette in a Paris prison known as the Bastille was almost an upside-down bottle, as it had a narrow pit at the bottom, and it was larger at the top, but was secured inside of a tower of a different room. The access to these dungeons was usually through a heavy door or a hatch or trapdoor in the floor in the room above, and this meant to gain access someone would have to be thrown down there. The term bottle dungeon is sometimes considered another word for oubliette, and there was a narrow entrance at the top of the dungeon, and the room below was often also very narrow, that it was impossible to lie down. In Britain there are a number of examples of dungeons like this. Alnwick Castle, which today is famous for a certain wizarding film, close to the English-Scottish border, had chambers and dungeons inside of the gatehouse, which was considered an oubliette. These underground rooms were accessed through a door in the ceiling, and were built without toilets. But it's not known who was held inside these rooms. It certainly wasn't guards, but some have considered that if prisoners were not held inside these dungeons, then it's possible that treasure or valuables were secured in them underground. The oubliette of Warwick Castle is not necessarily a bottle shape. This is almost the entrance to a larger room. The small short dungeon opens up to a larger chamber later, and this has a latrine shaft which would enter the small room, and it was a partially backed-filled drain. But there are accounts of prisoners being so fearful of Warwick Castle's dungeon during the 100 Years' War that they did anything not to fall into the hands of the English enemy. Bottle dungeons were also similar to pit prisons, where someone was thrown down a pit, and the difference was of course the shape of this room. One Scottish man who ended up inside of a bottle dungeon was David Beaton, the last Scottish cardinal before the Reformation and the Archbishop of St Andrews. It was said of his torture before his murder that Leslie wants the cardinal's body brought out of the dungeon and laid to rest somewhere more fitting. Will hangs his head over the bottle neck and quickly hauls it out again. The smell is bad, dank, airless and putrid. Surely the cardinal can't still be rotting after more than a year pickled in salt. Bottle dungeons were a feared part of a castle's imprisonment system, and they were usually basement rooms deep underground, which were only accessible from a hatch or a hole in the high ceiling. The shape prevented escape if there was ever a chance of surviving, and sometimes the fall from the entrance hatch to the floor of the dungeon was so significant that it could cause severe injuries itself. There was little to no chance of escape from the bottle dungeon. Blowing from a cannon has its roots in Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent, particularly in the Mughal Empire. It was reportedly used in the 16th and 17th centuries by Mughal leaders, and later adopted and refined by colonial powers, particularly the British Raj. For the Mughals, it served as a dual purpose: swift execution and dramatic display. The use of cannon fire rendered the body unrecognisable, preventing burial rites that were central to many religious traditions. The British, recognising this cultural impact, made strategic use of it. For Hindus, whose beliefs often require the body to be cremated whole for the soul to pass on, or for Muslims who require the body to be buried intact, this destruction of the body was more than just a physical death. It was, in a sense, spiritual annihilation. The method wasn't only a punishment for rebellion, but a deliberate desecration of belief and tradition. The most infamous use of the execution method came during the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as the First War of Indian Independence. The uprising, fueled by resentment towards British economic policies, cultural insensitivity, and military practices, was brutally suppressed. The British response to the rebellion was calculated, theatrical, and terrifying, and blowing from a cannon was central to that strategy. Captured rebels, especially sepoys, Indian soldiers who were within the British Army, were often sentenced to this gruesome death. Public executions were staged to instill fear and discourage others from joining the cause. Large crowds were forced to watch as bound prisoners were lashed to the muzzles of cannons, often with their backs facing the weapon. When the cannon was fired,
The result was horrifying. The torso might be vaporized, while limbs, head, and organs were hurled dozens of feet in all different directions. Blood and flesh would rain down on spectators, many of whom were deliberately gathered to witness the British display of power. These weren't quiet, peaceful, private executions. British officers and colonial administrators documented them, and some even posed for photographs near to cannons after the executions. In some cases, the cannon crews were Indian themselves, forced to fire upon their fellow countrymen under orders. The aim was to destroy not just the body of the rebel, but the morale and cultural unity of the entire population. Now, why was this method worse than you'd think? For one, it was not just the act of killing, it was the manner of the killing, the location, the audience, and the symbolism. Death by hanging or shooting, while brutal, often leaves the body largely intact. The victim retains their physical identity in death, but blowing from a cannon made the body vanish in an instant. There was no funeral, no remains to bury, no last rites, no closure. In some accounts, witnesses described the terror in the eyes of the condemned as they were dragged to the cannon. Others, forced to clean up the remains afterwards, reported finding bones embedded in nearby walls or scattered across trees. Soldiers described the sound as deafening, and the aftermath as a blood-soaked nightmare. For religious Hindus, the obliteration of the body meant that the soul might wander endlessly in torment, unable to reincarnate. For Muslims, it meant a denial of a proper burial and judgment in the afterlife. The British, aware of these spiritual beliefs, used the method because of the added psychological cruelty. It wasn't enough to just kill the rebel. They had to destroy his identity, soul, and also legacy. Accounts from the time show how important the theatrical element of the executions was. The British used cannons placed in open squares, with villagers and townspeople forced to gather and watch. Children were sometimes present too. In these settings, blowing from a cannon wasn't just a punishment, it was a public exhibition designed to etch fear into memory. Some reports claim that the British would execute multiple prisoners at once, using a line of cannons to fire in unison. The noise, the sudden spray of blood and viscera, and the sudden silence that followed created a lasting impression on all those who witnessed it. Even today, this concept provokes horror. In modern media and historical texts, it's often included on lists of the most terrifying execution methods ever deployed or used in history, but few understand how calculated and culturally devastating it truly was. By the late 19th century, as colonial powers became more sensitive to global scrutiny and ideas of human rights began to gain traction, the use of such executions declined. However, the memory of blowing from a cannon lingered. It remains one of the most horrifying symbols of colonial repression in India, a method remembered not just for its gore, but for its utter disregard for human dignity. In Indian literature, art, and oral history, the method has become a symbol of martyrdom and suffering. Statues and memorials commemorate the rebels who were killed in such gruesome fashion, and modern historians have studied the psychological warfare waged by such punishments. Blowing from a cannon is more than a macabre footnote in history. It's a powerful reminder of how execution can be wielded not just as a tool of death, but as an instrument of cultural destruction. Far worse than a quick end, it robbed its victims of identity, of funeral rites, and of humanity. It turned death into an absolute, public, horrific spectacle, and turned suffering into a warning, and brutality into a state-sanctioned message. It was not just an execution. Blowing from a cannon was an annihilation. And if I'm honest, that's why it's worse than you'd think, because it wasn't just physical. The impact on the people who saw it was horrific.
The maiden was an execution device which was used in Scotland between the 1500s and 1700s, mostly in Edinburgh. It was a device which was introduced in 1564 during the reign of Mary Queen of Scots, and its final use was in 1716. It was a device which came a long time before the guillotine, and the maiden was built in Edinburgh and was made of oak, and on it was a lead weight and also an iron blade. Machines like this were not new, and there were other examples in Britain, for example the Halifax gibbet. By 1563 in Scotland, the sword which was used for executions in the capital was worn out, and then money was used to pay for the loan of a sword for beheadings. So the Scots, when they wanted to execute someone using sword, would pay to borrow an executioner's sword to perform the job, rather than to simply make their own. But after this, the provosts and magistrates of Edinburgh conceived the idea of the maiden, and it was constructed to become a reliable and cheap method of execution. The original maiden was made by Adam and Patrick Shang and George Todd. A blacksmith, Andrew Gotterson, added the lead weight on the blade after the other men had made the frame. They were paid for their work, and Shang was interestingly the maker of some of the royal furniture. But the time then came for the first execution using the maiden. The first life and head claimed by the device was that of Thomas Scott of Cambus Michael, who made his way to the device in Edinburgh on the 3rd of April 1565. There were funds allocated for moving the parts of the maiden from Blackfriars in Edinburgh to the town's cross, where the execution would be carried out. The different parts could be collapsed easily and then dismantled for storage when the time came around, but the executions using the maiden took place at the Mercat Cross in Edinburgh, and also on Castle Hill and the Grassmarket near to Edinburgh Castle. The device could be lent and moved, and this happened in 1591, when Leaf needed the device to execute William Gibson. But one of the most high-profile victims of the maiden was the regent James Douglas IV, Earl of Morton, who helped to rule the country during the minority of King James VI. Douglas had fallen from grace, and he was then taken to Edinburgh for his execution on the 30th of May 1581. He was kept on the Royal Mile, 100 metres from the maiden and his execution site, and he would be executed 3 days later. The blade of the maiden fell and took Douglas's head clean off, and it was said to have been clean work, but following his death his corpse was left at the foot of the maiden on the scaffold for a day to act as a warning. His head was placed on a spike high above Edinburgh. Some historians have claimed that it was the 4th Earl of Morton who brought the device to Scotland, having seen it work in a similar way in Yorkshire with the Halifax gibbet in operation, taking the heads of serious criminals, yet he would lose his head on the device. In its time in operation, which was roughly a century and a half, over 150 people were executed on the maiden. Archibald Campbell, the first Marquess of Argyll, lost his head on it, as did his son who shared the same name as him. They are probably the only father and son combination to lose their heads on the same device, but both were executed for being rebellious. The last execution on the maiden took place on the 30th of June 1716, and John Hamilton was beheaded on it as he was convicted of murdering a pub owner. Following this execution, the maiden was then stored away, and it can still be seen today. But the way the maiden worked was similar to the guillotine. The executed person would place their head on the crossbar of the device, which was around 4 feet from the bottom. Then lead weights were attached to the axe blade. The blade would be guided through grooves cut from the frame. A peg was attached to a cord, and this kept the blade locked in place before the executioner would decide when it was time for the execution to take place, and then he would take out the peg, and this would cause the blade to fall and take the head off the condemned. Shockingly, sometimes, if a criminal was linked to animal theft, the executioners would attach the animal to the cord, and when they were driven off, the blade would fall. But the maiden was an execution device which would inspire the guillotine in France, which would take the lives of thousands. The guillotine and the maiden had a number of similarities, including the frame, and also the way the blade fell and took the head clean off. But the guillotine would be a device which would take the heads of the French King Louis XVI and his Queen Marie Antoinette, as well as many different politicians and key figures. But the Scots would get rid of the maiden in the early 18th century, but the specific device of the Edinburgh maiden would take over 100 people's lives, and their heads would be placed high above the castle and in other structures and gates around the Scottish capital.
The upright jerker, as an execution method, emerged inside of America, and it was used throughout the 1800s and 1900s as a variation on hanging. It was a device which was aimed to replace the gallows, and instead of going through a drop on a scaffold platform, then the point of the upright jerker was to send the condemned into the air. There was a number of shocking hangings which went terribly wrong throughout the years, for example the execution of Black Jack Tom Ketchum.
The cowboy and outlaw was arrested and was condemned in public by hanging in Union County in April 1901. But the execution went terribly wrong, as the executioner used a rope that was much too long, and the result of this was that his head came off as he plunged through the gallows. One witness to this said, "He walked firmly up the steps, saying as he went up, 'Dig my grave deep, boys.' Stepping upon the trapdoor, he asked for the black cap, and it was placed over his head, but it had to be removed to permit the rope to be placed on the neck. And whilst this delayed somewhat, he became impatient and said, 'Let her go, boys.' The sheriff cut the trigger rope with a hatchet, and his body shot down, with all its 215 pounds of weight. Everyone within or without the stockade held their breath, and their hearts gave a great bound of horror when it was seen that the head had been severed from the body by the fall. His body alighted squarely upon its feet, stood for a moment, swayed, and fell, and then great streams of red blood spurted from his severed neck, as if to shame the ground upon which it poured. The head rolled aside, and the rope released, bounded high, and fell, with a thud upon the scaffold from whence it came. The upright jerker, as you would probably guess, was aimed to push the condemned into the air in a jerking motion upwards. This was done as a noose was secured around the neck of the condemned, as was done normally with hangings. However, rather than the condemned being plunged through a trapdoor, through a scaffold, with the release of a platform underneath them, there was a system of weights and pulleys that was released, which would send the condemned into the air, and the aim of this was to instantly snap the neck of the condemned in a quicker manner, and to prevent botchings occurring like as in what happened to Black Jack Ketchum. However, the warden of Connecticut's State Prison obtained a patent in June 1895 for the creation and use of an automatic gallows, as in the upright jerker device. There were executions using this style gallows that occurred in the States in different places, including Connecticut, and specifically Gerald Chapman, a murderer, was executed on the jerker. Chapman was known as a gentleman bandit, and he was the first criminal documented in the press to have been public enemy number 1, and he lost his life on the device. But in terms of its effectiveness, it did not really work to snap the neck of the condemned quickly in the manner that was intended. Instead, the victim would be hoisted up into the air, the noose tightened around the neck, and they would then be strangled in mid-air, left kicking and struggling for sometimes minutes until death came. One man who was executed in 1860 on the device, a man named James Stevens, suffered a botched execution. When the upright jerker was released and the weights flung him into the air, his neck did not snap, and it was documented that he was left contorting, struggling, and gurgling until the life was choked out of him over a number of minutes. Eventually the device was retired, and the gallows with a trapdoor was more favoured inside of American prisons and inside of law. But the upright jerker was an execution device which was a variation on the gallows, and it was not the most effective in its use. It was intended to solve issues with reliability and botches, but it did none of the sort, and actually made executions more problematic for the executioners. Some prisons did continue to use the jerker, but it was actually eradicated after a number of decades. Being buried alive would cause death through either suffocation, dehydration, starvation, or even hypothermia. However, whilst interred underground, someone could last some time, and this would result in someone dying rather slowly, as opposed to other methods of execution. This would be torture, as someone would have a significant amount of time to comprehend their death and imminent demise, and this would have been horrific psychological pain. It is a common fear being buried alive, and has been used for centuries. Inside of China, the burning of books and burying of scholars was carried out by the first emperor of unified China. In this persecution, hundreds of books and texts, deemed too progressive, were burned, and also 460 Confucian scholars were buried alive in the year 212 BC. There have been doubts whether this actually happened, or whether it was just propaganda, but German tribes would also use burial alive. They would tie a victim to a wicker frame, would then push them down in the mud and bury them, causing them to suffocate. It was even debated that the execution method was used in England during the Dark Ages, and ancient Persia used the custom too. It was said, "It is a Persian custom to bury people alive, for I have heard that a mistress, having grown old, caused 14 children of the best families in Persia to be buried alive, to show her gratitude to God, who is said to be underneath the earth." so here it was used as a method of sacrifice. But one execution method linked to the practice was immurement. This was when someone would be walled in alive, and a group who was subject to this was the Vestal Virgins, who when they broke their vow of celibacy, they were immured alive and buried inside the city of Rome. They were held inside subterranean cells, and were then left to perish and suffer, and there were 10 accounts of the women being immured for breaking their vows. Elizabeth Bathory, the Hungarian countess, who is linked to Vlad the Impaler, was immured inside of a number of rooms in 1610. She was sentenced to this as she was deemed a murderer who possibly had hundreds of victims. 4 years after her immurement was sealed, she died inside of the rooms, but was supplied with food. Inside of Denmark, in a city statue, there was a female robber who was buried alive, and it was said in Danish law that adulterous women were punished in this way. But inside of the Roman Empire, there were many offences that could lead to someone being buried alive. These include infanticide and murder, and female murderers risked the punishment. There was one example in 1505 in Germany of a 13-year-old girl being buried alive beneath the gallows, where a 12-year-old boy was being hanged. Further burials continued throughout the centuries. For example, 10 women were subject to this in Berlin, and also one woman was even impaled through the heart after her burial. This combination of live burial and impalement was used specifically in Nuremberg, but was deemed too brutal, and instead the local council changed their method of execution to drowning. It was said in one execution, the verdict commanded the executioner to place the perpetrator in the grave alive, and place 2 layers of thorns, the one beneath, the other above her. Prior to that he should place a bowl over her face, in which he had made a hole, and to give her through that a reed or tube in the mouth, then jump 3 times upon her, and lastly cover her with earth. In the 1500s in the Habsburg Netherlands, the Catholic Church tried to eradicate any Protestant influence inside the country. To do this they used live burial as a method to punish women who were found guilty of heresy, and the last of these women executed took place in 1597. It was said that when this lady's head was above ground, she was given a chance to recant her faith, and when she refused to do so, she was covered up and died. This execution caused huge protest at the time, and forced the authorities to calm the persecution down, switching to using fines to punish heretics rather than death. Russia also used burial alive, and they called it the pit. Women who murdered their husbands were thrown into the pit, and there were many other accounts throughout the centuries of people being buried alive. The Khmer Rouge used this practice as a form of execution in the killing fields, and during Chairman Mao's regime it was also used. The fear of burial alive was even utilised by the mafia, and during the Second World War there were large-scale atrocities committed by the Japanese army. They buried dozens of people alive during the Nanking massacre, and the Germans also used this against Jews in Ukraine and Belarus, as they committed huge persecution and killings on the Eastern Front. As mentioned, one common fear is being buried alive, and throughout history it's been used a large number of times by many different countries. It would have been a horrific way to go, as slowly someone would be suffocating, and they would be aware of what was happening to them. As each spade of earth was placed on top of someone, they would be closer to their fate. Immurement was also incredibly terrifying, and being walled in was another form of this execution, which was savage. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.